this dialogue will set off a good tone for today. They're talking about issues that are important, issues that are certainly very critical when we talk about cancer care, and particularly getting medical innovation to the patients that need that in a way that is efficient and effective for them. As we get into the conversation, maybe we can talk about the developments in medical innovation around cancer. And I'll start with you, Dr. Fonseca. Maybe you can talk a little bit about, in your experience, the innovations that have occurred over the last 5-10 years and how that has transformed the potential for cancer care, particularly here in the US.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity and the invitation. Just for background, for those in the audience, I'm actually a practicing oncologist. I do specialize in an area of oncology, multiple myeloma, although the issue is relevant across the board. When I first started 20 years ago doing this, actually we were much less able to control disease than we are nowadays. So back then, we're talking about median survivals of 2 to 3 years for patients. Now it's not rare to tell someone they have over 50, 60, 70% chance of being alive at 10 years. So things have changed dramatically. So there is no question that medicine is much superior than what it used to be. And part of the reason we're here, of course, we want to find solutions, as well as express concern about some of the pathways that have been proposed to tackle some of the issues regarding the economics of cancer. So what I've seen is great. There's a lot of promise, there's optimism, and I just don't want that to stop.
So as we talk about that optimism, one of the issues and studies that you had talked about was the importance of sequencing. Maybe you can share that experience, an example, and the impact that it's had, particularly for the patients, in driving the right treatment to those patients.
The importance of sequencing?
Yes, exactly.
Well, we're really at the brink of one of the greatest revolutions that will happen in cancer, and that is to truly personalized medicine. I think we have great examples where that already has proven to be successful. We have examples where a single drug can control a disease for many years, sometimes making patients have a life expectancy that approximates that of the general population. Now we have more information, we have better tools, we have the ability of doing genomes under $5,000, and you'll hear more about that during the rest of the day. But the reality is we have the puzzle pieces, and some of them are starting to come together, and I think it's going to be just like that. Just like when you're dealing with a puzzle, as more pieces fall into place, and it becomes easier to solve. And I think, again, I'm just going to say that I think the future is bright, and there should be optimism based on this knowledge.
So rounding that perspective, Stacy, in your organization, you've talked about the impact on patients and the macro and the micro impact that these innovations, maybe you can elaborate more on that experience and what these innovations have meant for patients, the broader economy, and then for families in particular.
Yeah, so patients now have access to medications that they haven't had before. They can use pharmacogenetic testing to skip medications that may not have been effective for them in the past, to go straight to the medications that are most efficient. But what we're seeing now is that there are some barriers to treatment for them, so they can't access those medications that are most suitable for them. And those barriers are sometimes discriminatory and violate consumer protection laws and Affordable Care Act. They are cost containment measures aimed to save money, but in the long run, they're discriminatory. So you have step therapy, where you have to fail on maybe an ineffective medication before you can get to the more effective medication. And now we're seeing several lawsuits because of that. So earlier this month, there were seven insurers who were sued because they placed most, if not all, of the medications that treat HIV or AIDS in the highest cost specialty tier. So that means patients were forced to pay up to 50% coinsurance out of pocket, which is thousands of dollars a month, which essentially served as a pre-existing condition exclusion, also possibly violating the non-discrimination provision of the Affordable Care Act. So although there are several innovations available, now we're seeing some barriers there.
So let's jump right into it and those barriers. Bob, why is this topic so polarizing? The conversation, we talk on one hand, developments that are very positive and new innovations that are coming to the market and giving patients options, better options in terms of how they can be treated. But the conversation, when it comes to actually how they get to market, is so polarizing.
Well, it's polarizing because there isn't a value framework. There's two different sets of values shaping people's perspectives. And in my opinion, and I think the evidence suggests it, that the medical innovation, the title is Role of Medical Innovation in the Cost of Cancer Care. You know what the role is? Medical innovation reduces the cost of cancer care. It reduces the cost of treating HIV. I don't know, this is from the New York Times. I know you said no PowerPoints, but no one said anything about holding up a piece of paper that no one can see in the back. But this is from the July 3rd, 1981 New York Times about the first outbreak of HIV. Now, I'll give you an example, and then I'll talk a little bit about cancer. So the first HIV drugs in randomized trials showed no efficacy over placebo. A slight, but people in the community saw a benefit. That led to, and there was a very small increase in survival, maybe 3 months. Well, according to the value frameworks of our time, those HIV treatments would not be covered. Another step, because we don't just worry about whether there's a value, we assign a value to patients. You know, we say their life is only worth $100,000 when, you know, maybe we have a choice about, you know, whether it's valuable or not. But the VA, just an example from 1992 to 1998, increased their spending on HIV drugs by 500%. Now, you have a panel, well actually the ICER, a group called ICER, that says we should only increase the spending on drugs by GDP plus 1%. So I can tell you what would have happened to the costs of care to HIV patients. It would have gone up and more people have died. The same thing is going on with cancer, Dave. Since 1996, we have gone from spending 68% of our healthcare dollar cancer care for hospitals. Now it's down to like 40%. There are half as many patients going into the hospital for cancer than there were 20 years ago. If we were just treating cancer and just looked at the incremental improvement in certain patients and didn't look at the long term, a lot of people would be dead today. So really, the reason it's contentious is you always have perennial pessimists who say, we can't afford it, we're running out. It sounds like my parents. We can't afford it, you know, what are you wasting money for, you know, to spend it on something else, and they're always wrong. We're always wrong. The medical innovation is what makes healthcare and cancer care affordable.
So Jonathan, add to this from the patient perspective. We've talked a lot about some innovations, I think in lung cancer, one that your organization is helping people understand what those options are. But it sounds like the innovations aren't necessarily, for whatever reason, getting to the marketplace, and this conversation of value may actually be holding back that innovation, at least giving options to the patients they need. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, the baseline point is that if the innovations aren't getting to market, then that's the problem to attack. I feel like what we're talking about here is a totally imperfect sense of market, because to us, something has gone terribly wrong in the national conception of patients and their role and their place in the American healthcare system. As we have, I think, developed a sense today of having medical innovation and the cost of cancer care in parallel ways, it has, I think, led to the promulgation of a mindset that to us is an anti-patient future. As long as we are considering that patients and their medicines are too expensive to treat and too costly to save, we will inevitably set up a system in which patients can never win. And so, as you mentioned with lung cancer and those sense, medical innovation, as Bob said in the role and the cost, the fact is medical innovation is not the good choice or the better choice. It's the only choice. It's the only choice for patients. And as you speak to them and ask about their value, about their concept of what they're looking for, what they tell us as a baseline view is, save my life, help my family. And the only way we're going to get there is to let innovation take it as far as it can go. And finally, we have to have, obviously, an informed conversation and a deeper dialogue. But to us, the sense of where the trend right now is setting up patients as a commoditized drain on national resources instead of a community of individuals who we know how to care for.
You know, I just want to respond to that for a second, because let's be real.
Not to disagree. You just,
well, of course not. I was going to say, can we have second breakfast?
I think so.
Okay, good. when we talk about the cost, okay, let's be real. We're talking about drug prices, all right? And the reason drug prices are such a big issue, first of all, back to the value issue, some people just don't like the fact that companies are profitable when they develop new drugs. Okay, you got to deal with that. But the other thing is that the biggest increase in profits in the healthcare system have not come from the pharmaceutical industry as a sector. I mean, they're actually become less profitable. The biggest profitability increases, sometimes by increases of 90% per year, are the pharmacy benefit managers who take the drugs that the drug manufacturers sell and get about 30 to 40% of that in rebates, put that in their pocket, hand it off to insurance companies, and then charge as Stacy pointed out, charge patients, put the patient in the highest cost-sharing tier, charge them 30 to 40% of the retail price. And then they turn around and say, oh, well, these drug prices are unsustainable. And now you have people that are computing the value, which are enabling that rigged system. And to my mind, when you start kicking drugs off of formularies to save money and make money, that's not the market. That's like a protection racket. And the reason that prices are high is because it's profitable for the PBMs to make them. I heard I've talked to people in the industry, and I'll give you the Sovaldi example. Express Scripts and CVS, they didn't want a $20,000 a year hepatitis C drug. They wanted an $80,000 because 40% of 80 is a lot more than 40% of 25. So when we talk about price and we talk about cost, let's talk about the fact that a small percentage of patients are systematically being screwed and denied access to maximize the profits of an entity that does not produce the innovative solutions that everyone's looking for.
So Raphael, I know that from your perspective, you've also had your criticisms, the lack of objectivity as we talk about this topic.
Thank you.
As you give your perspective, help us shift from the issues which we need to raise to those potential solutions and where the dialogue can go around value.
So of course, and to your first point, you might ask yourself, what is a doctor doing in a panel that should be mostly composed of economists? Well, it turns out I'm in the front line. I'm one of those people that sees what happens with drugs and happens with patients. And we talked about objectivity. It's been said that in war, the first thing that dies is truth. And I think the first thing that has died in this dialogue has been that objectivity. So for instance, just a couple of simple examples. People talk about the copays, what patients are paying for copays, and patients have to sell their homes and their farms. People are tearing their robes with that. It turns out that in a very recent study looking at specialty medications, the average copay for a person is $35 in the United States. People say, well, these drugs are driving patients bankrupt. In fact, if you read in detail all the bankruptcy studies associated with the diagnosis of cancer, which no doubt is a big financial burden, none of them specifically assign that bankruptcy to the cost of medications. It's the lack of work by the patient, their caregiver, the hospital bills, and many, many other factors. There's this discussion, well, how good is a cure that no one can get? Well, it turns out that I cannot think of a single example in my practice, and now that involves patients who have fixed incomes, who are on Medicare, who have limited resources, who has not been able to get their medications as we prescribe them for multiple myeloma. In fact, I just confirmed this yesterday with our nurses. This notion that there's a red pill and a blue pill and somehow they're equivalent and it's just foolish or greedy doctors that kind of choose a more expensive one is really not a reality. There are some examples where that has happened, but in fact, almost all medicines have a difference. And that's why we don't necessarily agree with this stepped approach. And last but not least, from the patient perspective, is the whole ethical thing of actually discussing the cost with someone who's at the most vulnerable point in their career, and that is a patient who's diagnosed with cancer. So am I going to go and sit with a person and say, well, listen, we have this treatment, maybe it's not as good, but it's a little bit cheaper, maybe it's good for your family, think about inheritance and so forth. That really makes no sense to me. So I think it's really important to have the full spectrum, both from pharmacoeconomics, but all the way to the bedside.
So, Jonathan, where do we go from here in this conversation, where on one end, the promise of medical innovations, and later in the event, we'll talk about the value of precision medicine, the importance of new therapies like immunology. How do we facilitate a very unique healthcare sector, particularly here in the US, that drives those innovations to the patients that need them in a way that is not just cost effective, but driving the outcomes in a way that is positive for the patients?
Well, the pathway to a unique healthcare system is a unique healthcare dialogue and conversation. So what you're doing here today, and what I hope we're all doing here today, is contributing to that. Look, all the players are going to have to be involved. But it seems to me very obvious what we're hearing on the front lines and in the various sectors, that to place and arrange the concept of cost, which is a concern in an obvious reality of finite resources. But to me, patients are then placed sort of in the muddled middle when they should be in the direct and constant forefront. The idea that patients and their medicines, for the support of economics, for support on the front lines, are in any way a threat to longer-term health for this country is just simply dangerous. And so to me, and Bob mentioned nicer with these things, is that, look, we're going to have this informed, deeper dialogue, but the idea that we can set up complicated formularies of math that then tell the system, how do we limit patients, is to stop thinking. And so my concern with an entity like ICER is that it is, I say classically, the think tank that has stopped thinking. And for us to start at that point, to throw up our hands, there can be no more, you said, there can be no more efficiencies, no more innovations, no more improvements, no more perfections to a system that we all know needs work and help and improvement, and which can all be done to the aspect of billions of dollars to put more downward pressure. But my point, finally, is that the trend here is one that therefore is extremely dangerous. And for us to, I think, we are going to have to, therefore, move away from later on in the day, the dialogue and the value framework structure, and towards the development and then the distribution of a new patient-centered, patient-friendly value framework not tied to the mistakes and the policies of the past.
I'm working on one of those solutions. I'm not just a cranky economist. I'm working with a number of stakeholders, including payers and oncologists, to develop combination therapies matched to driver mutations, epigenetics, exome, the tumor microenvironment, and to measure the impact on survival in metastatic cancer patients. So in 200 evaluated patients, 61% were fully sequenced and fully treated with the medications. The others got partial or standard of care. The group that got the full complement of drugs, there was only 6% had progressive disease. 30% had progressive disease in the partial, standard of care, or got no sequencing coverage whatsoever. Only 72% had progression. We've done the economic analysis, and it's a lot cheaper per patient to treat upfront using combinations of therapies than doing standard of care. What's the rate limiting factor? The rate limiting factor is insurance. The patients, the 61% of patients that got fully sequenced and fully covered, their drugs were paid for. Everybody else, maybe some, maybe not. At the end of 2.5 years, I asked the physicians a question: how many of the people in the trial are alive? And the only ones that are alive are the ones that have been fully covered. So the good news is that if you go to insurers and you go to providers with the data, they will not just support, they will not just pay for things, they will join you in the effort. So it's really incumbent upon clinicians to step outside the randomized trial box, to seize upon these opportunities and demonstrate, as Stacy pointed out, when a drug works or when drugs don't work and when they do. Engage people early in the process to doing it. And I think, and I've been at many conferences like this where once you get beyond the political spin, everyone's on the same page that way. We all want to do what's best for patients, and we want to do it in the most effective, compassionate way possible.
So Stacy, you've advocated for a number of enabling initiatives when we talk about taking these individual cases and scaling it in a very complex and fragmented system. What are some of those examples? What could be done that would empower patients and allow for the innovation to reach them in a way that is effective?
So we have to steer away from drug pricing, drug controls, and drug rationing. But what we need to do is we need to empower patients to value treatment, value healthcare. Right now it's undervalued, and we need to have them prioritize it over buying the next iPhone. And in addition to that, we need to have everybody throughout the entire healthcare system take responsibility for their role. So just last week, Allergan came out and said that they are committed to not price gouging, so they're not going to be raising their prices within the double digits every year. That's great. That's a good step. The FDA can clear its backlog of approvals so we can get more medications on the market. That'll drive up competition, drive down prices. Insurers can step in and stop increasing their premiums so much. There was a news article very recently that said insurers were exploiting the rising cost of drugs to justify increasing their premiums when it wasn't necessary. Hospitals can step up and stop overcharging on drugs that are administered in hospitals. Right now, we have charge masters where they're marked up pretty significantly. So everybody has a role, and everybody just needs to take responsibility.
So Raphael, within this conversation of value and how we take this forward from a medical practitioner, talk about your perspective and the role of physicians and other medical practitioners and helping us identify what are the right outcome measures for us to track. How do we implement the concept of a driving force toward the same goal within the system? Give a little bit of the perspective from the medical practitioner.
Sure. Well, there's multiple ways in which we can do this, but we start with the principle that for the physician treating the patient, the only interest is the patient in front of them. And this conversation is a little bit clouded to like whether the physician should respond to society or not. Your fiduciary responsibilities to the person in front of you. There's multiple ways. Let me just expand on what Bob said, this sort of N01 concept. I think as we look back 30 years from now, we're going to look back at how we do phase 3 clinical trials, and we're going to say that's how they fought, wars in the Napoleon time. They just lined up, 10,000 men and started shooting. Whoever had more standing at the end won, right? We need to get more tailored approaches based on some of this genomic knowledge. So for instance, I've been very critical of the report by the ICER group on multiple myeloma. And if you read that report, there's not a single mention of risk stratification. We as clinicians know we treat myeloma patients quite differently depending whether they have high risk or not, and what are some of the biologic factors that determine what's the best therapy for that patient. We are incorporating that. And when you just start talking about large phase 3 trials on comparative effectiveness research and you don't acknowledge that diversity of patients, then you're just completely losing an opportunity. And in reality, what you're doing is just providing common therapy for the most common genetic aberrations, and that's it. And if you don't have that, well, you're out of luck. That's how clinicians, clinical trial designers, and pharmacoeconomics can come together to improve the outcomes of patients.
So, Jonathan, how do we, building upon what Raphael was talking about, putting measures into the system that allows us to keep up with innovation? Because innovation has happened today, where we're going 5 years from now, very difficult for the market and the system to keep up with the science. How do we do that, but in a way that continues to be focused on patients, which is an important issue?
Well, we need the design development of a much better market. Look, there's been some emotion related to this debate and the conversation that I've had and what we've all, I think, observed and seen about motivations in various aspects. We've heard a lot about ICER. Look, I've talked to these people at length and appeared. I was in St. Louis at the release of the multiple myeloma report. And look, I'm not questioning anybody's motives.
I am.
I'm questioning, for the purpose of this discussion, after 9:30, I get that. For the purpose of discussion, I'm questioning the approach and the assumptions. I don't think they're evil. I think they're wrong. Ultimately, they're dead wrong. They're dead wrong because they place patients in a space in which they are targeted, in which they are focused upon, as I said, an economic drain on resources. They are the ones who are setting up this conversation, which is anti-innovation, but comes out to me as a conversation that says roads don't get built because of patients and their medicine. Schools don't get built, patients and their medicine. to take steps down this road is to isolate and therefore, I think, degrade a population of people who essentially are being treated or can't fight back or don't know and wouldn't know how to, and wouldn't know why this is happening. But to us, in the way that you mentioned, it's happening because of the assumptions and therefore the approach that as you go on, as you listen later on today, and as you observe the many speakers later on today, the advancement of all of the bright people who are speaking about the value framework structure, the pathway structure, to me, we should be reorienting all of this brilliance and all this institutional knowledge toward a streamlined system that places patients first, not simply as a way to manage, because in that way, they can never be placed at the forefront of any system.
Talking about pragmatic solutions, Bob, you mentioned an example, things that are already happened. Are there examples, I think you and I talked about ones coming from Medicare, that are already happening, that are working, that can shine a path forward instead of talking about a system that we're trying to change that may only occur 5-10 years from now? What are things that are working today that we can use as real examples that can be built upon tomorrow?
Well, I go back to the idea that we need to do more of the data collection of what's going on in the precision medicine space, the use of immunotherapies in combinations with other kinds of modalities, and then let the science speak for itself. I think that's the biggest part, Dave, because what happened is that, at ASH or at ASCO, oh my God, we're going to stack 3 immunotherapy, CAR T and checkpoints on top of it. This is going to cost $1 gazillion to treat one patient. When in clinical practice, once you treat to the patient, the dosing and the duration of the treatment, because the response is sometimes so substantial, is a lot smaller. So we need to, instead of letting our fears about running out of resources guide us, let the science guide us. That's the most important thing. The second thing I believe that we should do, and something that I'm involved in, and my friend Bob Tufts, who is not a Yankee fan, but a former major league player and myeloma survivor, and I are doing, is to go out to the patients and use the real-world evidence initiative of the FDA to generate data that can be used for reimbursement. What I mean by real-world evidence is, how do people respond? How are they feeling? What's the quality of life? What's their energy like? All the things that Raphael asked, which is never really captured in the system. We can develop that data and use that as a basis for not just approvals, but for reimbursements. The third thing I think is really technological. And I'm not going to cough because I'm not running for president. But the whole way we deliver and distribute drugs, I mean, how many of you here have an Amazon Echo in your room? All right, I thought I would see a lot more people, but anyways, I'm a nerd, what can I say? But Amazon's getting into the business of specialty pharmacy. You heard it here first, folks. In 5 to 10 years, Express Scripts and CVS, they're all going to be bought up or go out of business because you're going to be able to, based upon the kind of information that your physician generates, say, Alexa, send me my medicines, and it'll be shipped that day to you with inherent things built into it. So a lot of the digitization that's taking place will make the rent seeking that is driving up the cost obsolete, and I think create tremendous efficiencies in the delivery of care. So we have to be very, very careful. Again, and let me just go back to one other thing, science. When somebody says that the use of a myeloma drug is only worth $100,000 per quality life year, and we have to look at don't believe them. What's the evidence before that? What's the evidence that approach is going to be better for the patient than somebody else? Let's make sure that we're science-based. Let's make sure that we're taking the data that patients are generating and use that to drive reimbursement decisions. And then let's be open. Let's get more people should have Alexa apps in their home so they can get their drugs delivered.
I thank Dr. Fonseca most importantly. I'm a myeloma patient. I'm 7.5 years out. and I was deemed high risk at the time. And one of what Stacy said, if they had done fail first on me and it hadn't worked, I would not have been here today, most likely. I'm on a second generation of drugs now, which just went from liquid to pill form, which works better for me. Under what's going on with ICER, and particularly the use of QALYs, I would not be able to get those drugs and wouldn't be here today. And I'd like to address, I've seen notes that according to ICER for myeloma patients, 45,000 would not be here today if we followed their realm. And why is the quality adjusted life year even used? And why does ICER set it at 0.7 for a myeloma patient?
Well, he's talking about a study I did. So what he's referring to is the fact that ICER not only puts a quality cap on what the life is worth, but a budget cap. And without getting into the weeds of the methodology, which has, again, never been independently validated, and as, by the way, violates best practices of the International Health Technology Assessment Guidelines, they said, well, we can only afford to spend so much on these patients. So over the course of 5 years, X number of patients won't get covered. Setting aside the fact that they said, well, these people really won't need it anyways, given the increase, given their modest estimate of what new drugs would add to life years, there would be 45,000 fewer life years saved for myeloma patients. And a lot of people with myeloma, like my friend Bob, would wind up in the same boat as the people in the trial that I've been looking at, where not getting combination therapy because of insurance means that they're no longer here. Now that's cost effective, I mean, in the short run, but in the long run, I think we want a healthier, productive, vibrant society to pay taxes, to pay premiums, and et cetera.
Make one quick point about Bob Tufts and all multiple myeloma patients, and Dr. Van Sick has been more profound about this, is that you talked about you're on second stage. The fact is that, look, there is no cure for Bob Tufts' condition, but there are innovative treatments that allow him to be here today and in the strong way that he is. Without innovation, he wouldn't be here today, but there is no cure. We must, for patients like Bob and all of the tens of thousands, only innovation is their only hope, not systemic streamlining. The only hope would be the next therapy, the next breakthrough, the next innovation. Because there is no cure, we will get to that point. So to place a patient like Bob, to me, who must be placed at the forefront, without the next innovation, every myeloma patient has literally no hope. And so we need to consider where we are with advanced treatments that allow for miracles like this, but at the same time, until we get to that cure, we must embrace the same ethic and the same belief in allowing that to go forward.
Rafael, you want to add to that?
Yeah, if I could add, and this is very dangerous, and I sort of hate to harp on the negativity of this, but at the ICER meeting, one of the panel members that votes explicitly and publicly states, I just want you to know when the next round of votes comes for curve value, I'm just going to vote low on everything because I believe the money is better spent. So that's a respectable philosophy. I understand that. But for us to believe that actually should transpire into what we recommend patients, or to have a payer use that report to say, this is what's appropriate, I just find that preposterous. I just can't deal with that. Now, I'll give you an example of how dangerous it is. A few months back, I heard from a patient who was in the community where I live, who was denied treatment because the oncologist counseled them that, it's not worth it. You're probably going to bankrupt your family. So a newly diagnosed myeloma patient goes without treatment straight to hospice. And I'm saying people can live for 10 years now or longer with myeloma, sometimes even much longer than that. And I thought that was a rarity. I was just shocked that would happen. Well, at the ICER meeting itself, one of the members of the panel describes exactly the same situation. A patient and an oncologist that decide that treatment is going to be foregone because I would not overcome the disease. So I think we're walking in very thin ice when we have these discussions about value.
Here's a couple of other pragmatic suggestions. How many insurers or payers are in the audience here? Anyone? Don't be afraid, we're all friends here. I think that payers and providers should take two pledges. One, they will not use QALY in their decisions about coverage. And secondly, any of the money that goes to the PBMs and insurers in form of rebates should go to the patients to make them whole, if that's a barrier. And then let the companies make up the difference. So that will take the concern and the divisiveness off the table. Then we can have a conversation about, what really works for what patients.
And I like to add, when a medication is medically necessary, it's medically necessary regardless of cost. And that means when cost is taken into consideration for that medical necessity determination, that can violate state consumer protection laws. So there was a complaint filed by the New York Attorney General against an insurer for considering cost in the prior authorization determinations for hepatitis C medications. And they were requiring patients to progress to the point where they needed liver transplants before they could access this medication. And that violates the duty of good faith and fair dealing. So they can get in trouble for these things.
That was it.
So I think we have time for one more question, and one is popped onto the screen here from our app. And for those who don't have the app, you can put your questions through there. I'll go ahead and read the question, and we, as we're on the clock, be brief with our answers. There's talk about more treatment, but what about over-treatment? Why don't we address that palliative care is a viable option for empowering patients?
I can address that. Palliative care is an integral part of medicine. In fact, we engage them right from the beginning. They help us with pain management, symptom control, patients who get neuropathy, a bunch of things that they can help us with. The one danger there is that palliative care can sometimes be a pathway used to use less expensive pathways for care. So to put it very cynically, the patient who gets no treatment, the dead patient, is the cheapest patient for a payer. So that has to be very, very carefully monitored. So we work hand in hand. It's very empowering to patients. I think it should be an option for all patients, but one should be careful on how we use this for the global care of the person.
Yeah, ultimately, this is an excellent question, but that's the patient's choice with their doctor. The conversation here must place that first, and to interfere with it in a way that would block it rather than try to enhance it is the chief concern talked about here this morning.
Yeah, and with respect to overtreatment, the real way to solve the overtreatment issue is to find out what medicines work best and try to find, be able to treat the disease in its earliest manifestations. That, again, requires people to climb down from the culture war about cost and figure out what's the best way to optimize treatment for each individual.
Just to complement that, there is an example to this, is that, first of all, there was a Rand Corporation study that shows that undertreatment is 3 times as common as overtreatment,
Yes.
number one. The second one, this is how this conversation can suddenly get pretty poisonous. There's this campaign called Choosing Wisely that has been embraced by many of the professional societies. Everything is about doing less and choosing wisely. It's great. Those interventions should not be done, but there's not a single mention of things you're forgetting to do. So there's that bias towards the via negativa. Right. Let's do less instead of doing the right thing.
Yeah, so in the combination therapy trial that I'm involved in, to the outside observer, they would say, oh, that's overtreatment. You're giving too much, because you're stacking all these drugs. But in fact, it's the right treatment. So again, we have to, Groucho Marx says, who do you believe, me or your eyes? And let your eyes do the judging based upon what's best for patients. And don't use quality, use the evidence about what works. And if anyone doesn't incorporate the kind of things, the considerations that my fellow panelists have said, then it's time to find another provider or health plan.
Well, with that, our clock has reached 0. Thank you very much for our panelists. I think you've posed some interesting questions for the rest of our day.